is everybody?
Great.
Are you enjoying this fall weather?
Yes.
You get your pumpkins carved and getting ready for all that? Yes, no? Okay, we are going over the book of Joshua, the 6th book of the Bible. Okay? The reason we're going over it is because Joshua is the man after Moses who led the people into the promised land. What's that got to do with you and me? Joshua is the name that Mary and Joseph gave their son 2,000 years ago. That is literally his name. His name in Hebrew is Yeshua. If you directly translate that, it would be Joshua. So the Joshua of the Old Testament is a type or an image of Jesus. Joshua was the one who was going to lead the people in the promised land. The war for the promised land. Again, what does that got to do with you and me? It is our turn now. It is our generation now. We have to enter the spiritual battle for the promised land. You don't get to ride in a coach. Okay? You don't get to take a cruise ship into the promised land. It's going to be a battle. Now, for those of us who don't like that idea that there's a spiritual war going on, number one, there really is a spiritual war going on. And number two, we really have it a lot easier than they did 3,500 years ago. Show of hands, how many of you, when you leave here, are going to go live in a tent? Huh? You're going to go to an apartment or a house or whatever, right? You're not going to go back to a tent in the desert. So we have it a lot easier, do we not, than they did 3,500 years ago. And it's not going to be a physical battle. 3,500 years ago, the men actually had to carry swords and spears and whatever, and actually go physically fight. Ours is a spiritual battle. But make no mistake about it, there is a spiritual war going on. And it's going to get worse as time goes on. And there's not a man or woman sitting in here who is exempted. Sorry. There are no 4 Fs in God's army. For those of you who are older, especially you men, if you got a 4F designation during the draft, you didn't have to join the military. In God's army, we're all 1As, which means, you know, we're part of the battle, whether we like it or not. I called today's sermon Joshua Before Joshua, Part 2. So if you weren't here last week, let me explain. We have been learning about how God prepared the Joshua of the Old Testament for this upcoming spiritual war. How he was an assistant or an aide to Moses. So we're learning about the history of Joshua before the book of Joshua. That's why I call it Joshua Before Joshua. I thought it was going to be cute. Never mind. Joshua Before Joshua, Part 2. Now, I want you again, I'm going to start off today by giving you reflections or going back over what we went over last week. So if you weren't here last week, great. You get a quick little refresher. But the reason I do this often is it helps us to memorize. Anybody here ever going to school?
Yeah.
Remember when you had to memorize things? Okay, let's go way back. I'm going to go back to just a few years ago when he was in grade school. Do you remember how terrible it was to learn the times tables?
Yes.
Who was I was talking to not too long ago, a young person in church, and I asked them how that school was going, and they said it was going okay, and I said, what do you like about school? And they said, well, I'll tell you what I don't like, the times tables. Right, they're still doing the times tables. Things haven't changed. So, what is the best way to learn? Repetition, 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 repetition. To go over and over and over and over. And so sometimes I will go over the same thing again and again. Why? Because it's easier then to remember it. So I want you to remember that Joshua, the man in the Old Testament, the man who followed Moses, is a type of Jesus. Okay? He's what we'll call a shadow of the Jesus who is to come, our Lord. The Joshua in the Old Testament typifies Jesus. He's not an exact mirror image because Jesus was not only man, but he was the Son of God. Joshua was man. But these stories that you read in the Old Testament, many of the heroes of the particular book or story that you're reading are types, images, or shadows of Jesus. You all get that? So, for example, I put up there Isaac. Isaac is a type of Jesus. When you read this story of Isaac in the book of Genesis, you should be thinking about Jesus. Why? Because Isaac was uniquely begotten. He was a miracle baby. Remember? Sarah was 90 years old. Abraham was 100 years old. He was a miracle baby. Jesus was a miracle baby. Both of them were referred to as the only begotten, or uniquely begotten. In the book of Genesis, in chapter 22, I believe, Abraham is told by God, Abraham, take your son, your only son, Isaac, and take him up to the mountain I'm going to show you and sacrifice him there. You remember that story? It's called the binding of Isaac, where he has to tie his son up and he's getting ready to sacrifice his own son when an angel stops him, and then he looks over and he sees the lamb. Do you remember that story? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. All of that is a type of Jesus. See, because the Father was showing us that someday he's going to offer his son for our sins, as a sacrifice for our sins. So Isaac is a type of Jesus. So when you read the Old Testament, you read about Isaac, keep in mind Jesus. Another type of Jesus is Joseph in the book of Genesis. Jacob, Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob had 12 sons. His 11th son was his favorite, Joseph, because he was born to the woman that Jacob loved, Rachel. Remember, Jacob got cheated by his father-in-law, and he was given Leah as a wife, or Leah as a wife, but he had worked 7 years for Rachel. Remember that story? And so he had to work another 7 years for Rachel. And then each of the women, Leah and Rachel, gave him a concubine to have kids. It's a long story, and it's really involved, but you really need to read it because it's fascinating. So Rachel did not have children, did not have children, did not have children. Finally, she had a child, Joseph. So he became Jacob's favorite. Well, the other brothers didn't like that, and so they hated Joseph, and they betrayed him. They sold him to slave traders. They figured he's dead. Dad figured he's dead. So he's betrayed by his brothers, but he ends up becoming savior of his people. That sound familiar? Jesus was betrayed by his brothers, handed over to the Romans, and he ends up being savior not only to his people, but to the world. So when you read the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, you gotta see the shadow of Jesus. You all getting that? Mm-hmm. Then there's David. David was the son of Abraham. Abraham was told by God that one of his seed, one of his descendants, would be the blessing to the entire world. And so they started looking for this anointed one who would be the blessing to the world. Abraham had Isaac, but God said, no, it's not Isaac, but it'll come through Isaac. The seed of Abraham will come through Isaac, and he will be a blessing to the whole world. Isaac had Esau and Jacob, and God said, well, it's not either of them, but it will come through the seed that will be the savior of the world will come through Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. The Lord said that it would come through his fourth son, Judah. So Judah had Perez, Perez had Hezron, Hezron had Ram, Ram had Amminadab, Amminadab had Nachshon, Nachshon had, Nachshon had Solomon, Solomon had Boaz, Boaz had Obed, Obed had Jesse. My little sister's laughing at me. Why is she laughing at me? And Jesse had 8 sons, and finally God says, this is the son I chose to be the king of Israel. So David, son of Abraham, becomes the greatest king that Israel ever had. But he's not the Messiah. He's not the anointed one. He's not the one who's going to be the blessing of the whole. He was a blessing to his people. He was a blessing to Israel. He united the 12 tribes. David was a warrior, so, you know, the Messiah, when he comes, is going to be like King David. He's going to be a king and a warrior. So David is a shadow of Jesus. So when you read these Old Testament, Gideon or Barak or whomever, you've got to be looking for Jesus. These people are shadows of the one who is to come. Joshua is a shadow of the Jesus who is to come. Last week, I'm going to give you a refresher from last week. So if you weren't here, you get it the first time. If you were here last week, you get it the second time. Number one, God will not tolerate rebellion against himself. When the Israelites left Egypt, I want you to picture this. I picture the entire city of Denver and all its suburbs. Okay, 2 million people on the march, leaving Egypt, walking out into the desert, and as they leave Egypt and they go into the desert, they get met by this group of people called the Amalekites. And the Amalekites start attacking them. And they start picking off. Now, if you read the story, you'll find out the Amalekites attacked Israel at the back of the train. So as this great, massive exodus of people is moving across the desert, the weak, the tired, the weary, they end up at the back of the train. They're moving a little slower than everybody else. That's where the Amalekites start attacking. The weak, the helpless. And that really made God mad. So he tells Moses to have Joshua pick out some men and go fight the Amalekites. And I mentioned last week that a great Christian philosopher of the 20th century, Francis Schaeffer, said, anybody who attacks the Judeo-Christian religion or the Judeo-Christian culture is an Amalekite. And so we have a lot of Amalekites in the world today. They are attacking the Judeo-Christian culture and religion from every side today, are they not? They're Amalekites. That's what they are. They're Amalekites. God won't put up with that. And I also mentioned from Francis Schaeffer, the Judeo-Christian culture will, what's that big capital word?
Never.
Never. The Judeo-Christian culture will never be eradicated, even if we are poor examples. The Jews will never be eradicated. The world has tried to eradicate them for 4,000 years. There have been pogroms in Russia. There's been the Spanish Inquisition in Spain. There was Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust. Great Britain expelled all the Jews. The list just goes on and on and on. The world has attacked the Jewish people for 4,000 years. Today, the radical Muslims have said that we're going to drive the Jews into the sea. It's not going to happen. It has not happened for 4,000 years. Why? Because God gave a promise. He's going to bring the seed of Abraham to glorify the world and to save the world. And so he made a promise to Abraham that he would always have seed. And so from them, the Messiah was born, Jesus, and today we call him Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, and so we call ourselves Christians. The Judeo-Christian culture will never be eradicated, even though the world is going to try. Even when we screw up, even when we don't do what we're supposed to be doing. Because God made a promise, and that leads to today's verse, which you're going to see several more times, because I want you to remember this. From 2 Timothy 2:13, if we are faithless in our walk, if we are faithless, He, God, remains faithful, for He cannot deny Himself. He made a promise. He's going to keep that promise. He made a promise to Abraham that he was going to bring Abraham's descendants back into the promised land. And so 400 years after they went down into Egypt, God's bringing them back into the promised land. I made a promise, I'm going to bring them into the promised land. They were not faithful. They didn't believe God, they complained, they argued. We don't have water, enough water. God provides water. We don't have food, God provides manna. We don't like the food, we want meat. God provides meat. And so they constantly didn't believe. And then finally, when Moses tells the 12 spies to go and spy out the land of Canaan, because they're right on the southern edge of Canaan, getting ready finally after 14 months in the desert to go into the land of Canaan, the spies come back and give a bad report. And God said, that's enough. That's enough. See, they had been faithless. They had been unbelieving. Did God abandon them in the desert? Did he exterminate the Jewish people, the Israelites? No. Because even if we are faithless, when God's made a promise, he's made a promise. Now here's the good news for you and me. God's made a promise. If you believe in his son Jesus, if you've acknowledged him as Lord and Savior, listen to me. God's going to bring you through the pearly gates into heaven.
Amen.
Even if you're a lousy Christian. Even if you don't do what you're supposed to be doing. Read it again. If we are faithless, he what?
Remains faithful.
He remains faithful. Why? Because he cannot deny himself. I gave my word. God says, I'm going to keep my word. So even if we break our words and we walk off and we do things that we know we shouldn't be doing, God is still going to be faithful. Aren't you glad he's a faithful God? I mean, that's the whole. Read the Old Testament. The people of God were not faithful. But God remains faithful. Second point last week. Real power is not merely the power of the general of the sword. Real power doesn't come from man. Real power comes from God. That concerns when Moses told Joshua to go out and fight the Amalekites. Remember, Moses was carrying the staff, and he held up the staff. And when he held up the staff, the Israelites won. When his arms got tired and he lowered his arms, the Amalekites were winning. When he raised his arms back up, the Israelites were winning. When he put his arms down, the Amalekites would win. So finally a couple men stood on each side of him and held up his hands. And that's how they defeated the Amalekites. There's no magic, there's no magic, period. But there was no magic in that staff. It was a symbol of the power of God that God had given to Moses when he went to Pharaoh. Remember the staff? He touched the end of the staff to the Nile River and turned to blood. Remember that? So that staff has no magical powers. We're not ignorant. The staff is simply a symbol of the power of God. So when Moses held the staff up, that was saying, God is with us. You all get the point? Okay. Power, real power resides with God. Why is this important today? Because as I've mentioned before, the United States of America is the greatest superpower the world has ever seen. The United States of America is the greatest superpower the world has ever seen. We are greater than Rome. We are greater than Greece or Babylon or Egypt or Great Britain or any other power. Did you all know that 30% of all the goods produced in the world flow into the United States? We are the world's greatest consuming nation ever. You can go into King Soopers or Safeway or Walmart or Albertsons or wherever you do your shopping today and get fresh pineapples. For heaven's sake, it's the fall. You can get fresh bananas. Hello? Yes, can you not? Fresh fruit, can you not? Why? Because we have those bananas and pineapples and fruits and vegetables and everything else shipped from all over the world into the United States. for your enjoyment, for my enjoyment. We have the greatest military might ever. I mentioned before, we have 10 aircraft carrier battle fleets. 10. Every single carrier battle fleet in the United States has more destructive power than all the bombs dropped in Europe in World War II. Just one of them, and we've got 10 of them floating around. No other country has even one. We are the greatest superpower ever. Ever. But we better not think that that power is because of us. See? And I think this is part of where America is on the danger of. If we start thinking it's because of our generals and our technology and our power, we're on the danger of God. He might have to humiliate us to let us know who has the real power. Now, I'm saying, going to tell you something that is true that the world is denying. This truly used to be a Judeo-Christian nation. This truly used to be a nation dedicated to the Judeo-Christian principles. Even if not everybody in the country was a Jewish or Christian individual. I've used my family a lot as examples because it's appropriate. This may be one of the reasons why the Lord chose me to be a pastor, a teacher. My father, for 70-some years, was a pagan. I loved him. I was afraid of him. He was the big, tall, strong, mean man, but he was a pagan. Was he not, Carol? He cussed like a sailor. I mean, he was just a big, mean steel worker. But my father raised his family under Judeo-Christian principles without even knowing that they were necessarily Judeo-Christian principles. I'll tell you one thing, son. There are a couple things I can't abide. I can't abide a liar. My children will not lie. If I ever catch you lying to me, I'm going to beat your breast. Right? You know what I'm saying? Am I right, Carol? I can't abide a liar. My father taught. Where does that come from? That's right. Thou shalt not lie. The second thing I can't stand, son, I can't stand a thief. If I ever find out you've stolen something, I'll whip you. And you can fill in the blanks. Where did he get that from? Yeah, but see, he was a pagan. But see, the Judeo-Christian culture was woven into America to such a degree that people who didn't go to church knew basic Judeo-Christian principles. You know, you listen to me, boy. If you're ever on a bus or you're ever in a room and you're sitting down and an old person comes in, what do? You stand up and you offer them your seat. Where do you get that from? It's from the Bible. See, if I would have said, Dad, did you know that that's from the Bible? He wouldn't have had a clue what I was talking about. Rise in the presence of the elderly and show respect to those with white hair. That's what the Bible says. See, so he taught those principles even though he himself was not a Christian. For at least the first 70-some years of his life. You get my point? The Judeo-Christian culture was woven into America, but we've lost that now. We really have. We are in what's called a post-Christian America, people. And I'm just afraid that people are looking at things at a surface level, at a physical level, at a human level, and they think we're pretty secure, and we're pretty rich, and we're pretty this, and we're pretty that. And I think we've lost the concept that we are dependent on God because the real power comes from God. And I don't want you all to miss that point. Don't miss that point. Real power flows from the throne of heaven. This is what God decides. Point number 3. There is a place for what we call godly anger. Joshua was with Moses, the golden calf incident. Remember, Moses went up the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights to talk with God. God spoke to him, said, write this down. He gave him the 10 Commandments, but he also gave him a lot of other instructions, laws, rules. After 40 days, Moses comes down. Joshua joins him as they're coming down. They hear a bunch of noise in the camp. Joshua thinks it's a war. Moses says, that's not a war. That's a party going on. And he goes down, and the people down there Moses had been gone for 40 days. And so they started grumbling and complaining, we don't know what happened to this man, Moses. Maybe he's dead. Maybe he left us. We need to go back to Egypt. So they took Aaron, Moses' brother, and had him make a golden calf. And then they got up and partied and danced and had an orgy around the golden calf. Remember that? And so when Moses came down, he was mad. He had a right to be mad. These were the people of God acting like pagans. Next thing Joshua had to learn, because of that golden calf incident, was merely calling yourself or using the name of God is not enough. Just ask the Israelites. You see, they were called the people of God. They are the people of God, and yet they're having an orgy. They created a golden calf, a calf made out of pure gold. Aaron fashioned it. And then they said, this is what they said. You can read it. This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. This calf, this cow, which was a symbol of Egyptian god of fertility. That's why they were having an orgy. And they branded the cow with the name of Yahweh. Just calling yourself, in our case, a Christian is not enough. You all get the point? A lot of people call themselves Christians, but what does it say down there? Let's do what we want. You see, we are in danger when we think that we can call ourselves Christians and do whatever we want. No, remember what Jesus said, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I say? We need to be reading the Word and finding out what God wants us to do and be doing it, yes? Is this making sense? Because I'm telling you, there are a lot of Christians, and since we're Americans, I'm just going to stick to America. There are a lot of people in America today who call themselves Christians, who act like the world around them. Let's do what we want. And so, I'm telling you, look to the story of the people of God in the Old Testament, the Israelites, because it's the church's story. It's our story. And we need to learn from it, the good and the bad. Does that make sense? Yes. We need to learn the story. And finally, from last week, God tells us that He is going to guide us, but it's going to guide us like He did Joshua by His Word and by His Spirit. You see, God was with Moses in a different way. God was with Moses, and He would talk with Moses face to face in a tent of meeting. But Joshua had to learn a different way. Joshua had to learn the way you and I have to learn. We don't get, well, except for Cora over there, the rest of us don't get to see God face to face. Cora's looking at me like, what you eating, Willis? What are you smoking? We don't get to see Jesus face to face right now, do we? How do we communicate with God? Through His Word and through the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit guides us. We read the Word, you put the two together, and God says, do you get it, Don? Do you get it, Carol? Do you get it, Tana? Do you get it? Do you get it, Barbara? If you want to hear from God, you got to be here, people. That's how He speaks to us today, through His Word and through the Holy Spirit. Y'all get that? Yes. Okay. So, if somebody ever comes to you and says, God speaks to me directly, say, uh-huh. And give them that little look. Because God typically doesn't speak with us face to face. He doesn't do that anymore. He did that with Moses, starting with Joshua. Joshua had to learn a new way. And we have to learn a new way. When Jesus came to earth, he spoke with his disciples face to face. We have to learn a new way through the Word. Does that make sense? Okay, so what more can we learn about Joshua? In the wilderness, Joshua learned that it's about God's glory, not man's. He had to learn a big lesson. And so there's a story in Numbers. So I'll give you the story if you're not familiar with it. The people are complaining they don't like the manna, they want meat. God says to Moses he's going to provide meat. Moses says, where are you going to get enough meat? I think about this, too many people. Where are you going to get enough meat? If we slaughtered all of our cows and sheep and goats that we brought out of Egypt, we couldn't feed all these people. And God says, what? You think I can't? I'm paraphrasing. I'm making God sound like a Jewish man. Oh, what? You think I can't do this? I'm going to provide enough meat. And then Moses complains because, you know what, it's a burden. These people are always complaining. So God says, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I want you to bring 70 elders out of the camp to the tent of meeting. Because remember, Moses had moved the tent of meeting outside the camp after the golden calf situation. So, God tells Moses to bring 70 of the elders outside the camp to the tent of meeting. And I'm going to put my spirit upon them. Okay? So, the 70 men go out to the camp, and then God sends his spirit, and it falls upon those 70 men. They all start prophesying. But 2 of the men were not in the camp. So we read this. Moses gathered 70 men of the elders of the people, and he stationed them around the tent. Now remember, the tent is outside the camp. And so there's 70 men are outside the camp, and God's going to put a spirit on them. The Lord took up the spirit that was on Moses and put the spirit on the 70 elders. And what did they do? They all prophesied. But 2 of the men, for whatever reason, named Eldad and Medad, they were still in camp. They didn't get outside the camp. They didn't get a chance to get out to the tent of meeting. They were still in the camp. Maybe they're sick. Maybe they got detained. We don't know. All we know is 2 of the men who had been appointed didn't make it outside to the tent of meeting. And yet, the Spirit fell on them too. Because they were 2 of the 70. You all get the point? But they're inside the camp, prophesying. Oh, Joshua didn't like that. Joshua says to Moses, Moses, stop them, make them stop. The 2 guys in the camp, they shouldn't be prophesying in the camp. They got to be out here with the rest of the guys. Look what Moses says. Moses replied, are you jealous for my sake? You see, it had to come through Moses. Moses called the 70 out, and it was through Moses. And Moses says, Joshua, are you jealous for my sake? I wish that all the Lord's people, were prophets, and that Yahweh would put his spirit on them. I have to agree with Moses. I truly wish that the Lord made every single one of you a prophet or prophetess. I do. And that he'd put his spirit on you, like he has all the prophets and prophetesses in the past. You see, Moses wasn't about himself. Moses was about God. It's God who's going to put his spirit wherever he puts his spirit. You don't get that point? It's not me, it's God. The glory goes to who? God. But see, Joshua was offended because these 2 guys in the camp, they're prophesying and they're not out with the rest of it. They're not in the presence of Moses. There was another point here that Joshua needed to learn. And boy, this is a big, big lesson for all of you. The other point was what? You ready? We cannot bind God with man-made rules. You You see, there's a danger, people. Joshua had a rule, or he made himself a rule at this situation. God should not have put his spirit on the 2 men in the camp. You see, God told Moses, bring the 70 men out to the tent of meeting, and there I will put my spirit upon them. But these 2 men over here, even though they were 2 of these 70 elders, they didn't get out to the camp. For whatever reason, it doesn't matter. But they had been anointed, and so God put his spirit on them in the camp. Well, you see, that violated Joshua's rule. God said they're supposed to be outside the camp. God said they're supposed to be around the tent of meeting. They should be outside the camp around the tent of meeting. They shouldn't be inside the camp. God said it, we got to do it this way. Y'all get the point? Strictly following God's rules without understanding his principles leads to what? Legalism. Boy, you and I can very casually fall into legalism by reading the Bible and saying, well, this is what it says and this is the way it's got to be. Well, yeah, but do you understand that there's a whole lot more to the Bible than just the little section you're reading right here? You got to read the principles. You got to be able to put it all together and say, what is God trying to tell us? Yes, the direct rule, but is there any more to it than that, God? Yes. And Jesus taught us that in the greatest sermon he ever preached, the Sermon on the Mount. Boy, a lot of people have quoted the Sermon on the Mount. And a lot of people who are not Christians have said, because of the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus was a great teacher. A lot of people who are not Christians have said, Jesus was even a prophet. He was one of the wisest leaders that had arisen, like Buddha. Yeah, or like Muhammad, or like whatever. If people just followed the Sermon on the Mount, what a great world this would be. Not even understanding the points that Jesus was trying to make. So, over and over again, if you read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, you'll see Jesus saying, you have heard that it was said. You have heard that it was said. You have heard that it was said. Number 1, you have heard that it was said, do not murder. Do not murder. Everybody here, remember that commandment? Raise your hand if you've heard do not murder. Well, I could be pretty good because I've never murdered anybody. I'm okay with God because I've never murdered anybody. Oh, I would like to sometimes, but I've never murdered anybody, so I'm in the clear. And Jesus says, but I say to you, what? If you speak badly about somebody, you're in danger. Now, I liked how you all raised your hands when I said anybody here can say, I'm not murdered. How about this? I want you to raise your hands if you've never spoken ill about somebody else. Don't you raise your hands? That's right, no hands better go up. Jesus said not to speak ill of somebody else. Matter of fact, he says, if you call somebody else a fool, you're in danger of hellfire. You're guilty of murdering that person's character in front of somebody else. Whoa, does that change everything, huh? Suddenly Don can't go around saying, I've not murdered anybody, because Don has gotten mad at times and said bad things about people, maybe to my lovely wife. Maybe I've said something to her, not to anybody else, about somebody, because I was mad or bad. You know what I'm saying there, sister? Uh-huh. Have you all ever said something bad about somebody in the presence of somebody else? You've murdered their character in front of somebody else. And we don't think anything about it. We don't think anything about it. I remember going over to somebody's house one time and the kids were in the living room and mom and dad were somewhere else, you know. And So I'm talking to the kids, and the kids just start telling me this bad stuff about somebody. So I kind of just casually asked them, where'd you hear that? Well, Mom and Dad said. There you go. Mom and Dad didn't realize that the kids are listening to them, and so they are, what do kids do? They learn from Mom and Dad. And if Mom and Dad say this person's a bad person, what do they think about that person? There you go. You just murdered that person's character to your children. And we don't think anything about it. We don't even think about it. But Jesus said, you don't get the principle of thou shalt not murder. Let me tell you what the Father thinks about that. It's a lot bigger than what we think. Ooh, this is a good one. You shall not commit adultery. Boy, do I know a lot of people who walk around really self-righteous because I've been married to the same woman for 31 years. I've never slept with another woman since I married my wife. And my wife says, I've been faithful to my husband for 31 years. I've never slept with another man. Oh, great, so you can feel real pompous because you've been faithful. But this person over here, they're getting a divorce because she was unfaithful, he was unfaithful. And so you're feeling pretty self-righteous, aren't you? Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, thou shalt not commit adultery. But you don't understand the principle. But I say to you, if you even look at another person with lust in your heart, you've committed adultery. As far as the Father is concerned, you've committed adultery in your heart. You've violated that rule. So you understand what I'm getting at? Legalism says this, but God says it's much bigger than what you think. You need to learn the principles behind the rules. And we don't do that. Ooh, I like this one. How many of you heard this? I want you to finish this for me. An eye for an eye and... Say it again.
A tooth for a tooth.
A tooth for... You've heard that. Have you all heard that? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Could somebody tell me what that means? What it typically means? What does it mean? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth.
Somebody takes your eye and then you take their eye.
There you go. And what does that imply?
Somebody wrongs you.
Revenge. Revenge. Right? Isn't that what it means? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Do you know why God put that in the Bible? I bet you don't. I bet $100 you don't know. So I'm going to tell you. I'm going to give you a little history. Are you ready? Abraham, remember, came out of Ur of the Chaldees. He lived in Mesopotamia. Luther.
Yes.
He lived in Mesopotamia.
Okay.
We were talking about Mesopotamia earlier. Mesopotamia, Babylon. Did you know the Babylonians had a whole series of laws just like America? They had a whole legal code, just like America. And in their code, and in other countries, the Hittites or whatever, they had their legal codes. And here was the legal codes. It was much, much stricter. It was so strict that if a person assaulted you, you could kill them. And you'd be okay. They assaulted you, you can kill them. If you had a slave and you killed a slave, well, hey, he was a slave, she was a slave. You're okay. In other words, they codified, they wrote down in their laws that if this happens, you can do this, up to and including the point of death. Wow, that's kind of brutal, isn't it? So God has to have Moses put in the law. Listen, if you're so, and I'm going to use the word hell-bent, if you're so hell-bent on revenge, you can't take another person's life for this or this or this. At most, it can be an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. If a person assaults you and breaks a tooth, then at most, you can have that person assaulted and have their tooth broken. But we're not going to go into like the Mesopotamians. We're not going to go like the Hittites. We're not going to go as far as and then when it comes to slavery, God had Moses put in all these laws saying, if you have a slave, you're going to treat the slave this way, this way, this way. And after 7 years, you're going to set him free, and you're going to give him enough money so that he can establish his own family, da, 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 da. Wow. It's not that God was saying that he was for slavery. It's he was saying, this is what the people in the world are doing, and if you get into this, you're going to have a different set of rules, different set of principles. You all get that? But if you're so hell-bent on revenge, then you can only go up to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, that puts a whole different spin on it, doesn't it? Wow. You mean to tell me if Carol slaps me, I can't chop off her hand? No. No. So Moses sends 12 men to spy out the land. Joshua had to learn a very big principle here. And here's the principle. A man of God must stand and trust God, even against his own people, even if he's in the minority. God sent 12 men to spy out Israel, 12 different sections of Israel. And they went out. Only 2 of those 12 men actually had faith in God, Joshua and Caleb. What I mean by that is God had promised them the land of Canaan. He had promised them this land. He told them he was giving them this land, and they believed him. So when the spies came back, the other 10 said, there's no way we can take this land. The people are too big. There's too many of them. They have fortified cities. Some of the people are literally giants. We're like grasshoppers in their eyes. There's no way we can take... See, they were looking through physical eyes and not through eyes of faith. But Joshua and Caleb, they went into the promised land to spy it out with eyes of faith. And they weren't looking at the people and the conditions that could possibly be a problem. They're looking at the land to verify that it was like God said it was. It's a land of milk and honey. As a matter of fact, we brought back this cluster of grapes. Look at the size of these grapes. Look at it is a fruitful land. And yes, we can take the cities and we can take the land. Why? Because God has promised it to us. But the other 10 spies, there were 10 of them, only 2, Joshua and Caleb. And so the people listened to the 10, and they started wailing, we can't take the land, we should go back to Egypt. We should never have come out this way. We should never have done this. And God got mad. Over and over and over and over and over. Joshua and Caleb in the minority. First they were 2 against 10. As a matter of fact, after the 10 gave them a report, the entire people said to stone Joshua and Caleb. Can you imagine standing against the entire nation of people? Can you imagine standing there basically alone when everybody says they want to stone you to death because they don't like what you have to say? That's a man of faith. I don't care if you don't like the message. I'm speaking the message of faith. Yes? I'm speaking the message. I'm telling you, God said he's going to give us the land. He's going to give us the land. Trust God. And they didn't like that. So, they had left Egypt. They had spent 14 months in the desert. Most of them at the foot of Mount Sinai. There they built the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. And after it took them a year. If you read the scripture, it says it took them about a year to build that tent. It was a fancy tent with solid gold things inside, like the lampstand and the table showbread, the golden altar, and the mercy seat, and the Ark of the Covenant. And after a year of working on this tent and all its accoutrements, all its instruments and everything inside, God says, okay, it's time to enter the promised land. And so now they're ready. God's going to be with them. They go to the south part of Canaan, and Moses sends out the 12 spies. And they come back and they rebel again. Crybabies. Right. And guess what? God says, that's it, that's enough. That's enough. You whined about thinking I wouldn't provide water for you. You whined about thinking I wouldn't provide food for you. You whined because you didn't like the type of food I gave you. And now you're not believing when I told you I'm going to bring you into the promised land. Now you're saying you don't believe. That's enough. I'm tired of your rebellion. So you're going to walk through the desert for 40 more years till this entire generation's dead. And they all died. Except two. Joshua and Caleb. Do you think maybe you and I should be men and women of faith? Say yes or amen.
Yes.
Do you think you and I should be men and women of faith?
Yes.
We're not going to be like the majority, are we? We're not going to be like the majority. We're going to walk in faith with God, aren't we? And when the people of the world tell you, you got to believe this, you say, well, God says no. What do you mean no? You're a hater. No, I'm not a hater. I'm just saying I'm going to follow my Lord's teachings. Yes? But in order to follow your Lord's teachings, you need to know what the Lord has said. Yes? Which here it is for the 1,447th time. Are you ready? You got to read the Word. Boy, Brother Don sounds like a record that's... I'm old enough to remember vinyl records. Do y'all remember vinyl records?
Yes.
Do y'all remember when it got caught in a loop and the vinyl record spun and it zzz, 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 and it just wouldn't go any farther? Sometimes I feel like that. You got to read the Word. You must read God's Word. Yes, people? I'm telling you, please listen to me. When Jesus comes back and we all have our glorified bodies, I guarantee you every one of you is going to say, you know, Brother Don, you were absolutely right. Because it's a good suggestion. We should have read the Word more. We had time for, and you fill in the blanks. We had time for golf. We had time for vacations. We had time for going here. We had time for doing this. We had time for TV. We had time for this, time for this, time for this. But we just never seemed to get enough time for this. And Brother Don, you were right. I should have read the Word more. I cannot stress that enough, brothers and sisters. No matter how well you know the Word, there's always something more God will show you. I promise you. There's always something more God will show you. You cannot read it too much. I don't care. Just read it, reread it, reread it, reread it, reread it. God will show you something new. He always does. He always does. Despite the church's sin at the golden calf, now you notice I call the people of God the church. They were the church of the Old Testament, we're the church of the New Testament, but they were the church. As a matter of fact, the Greek word for church is ekklesia. Let me say it again. The Greek word for church is ekklesia. In the Old Testament, when the Old Testament writers wrote it in Greek, when they called the congregation of the Israelites together, the congregation, that word was ekklesia, which is what? Church. So the Old Testament says a lot. God said to Moses, call the church together. Call the congregation together. So when I say, despite the church's sin at the golden calf, despite the church's rebellion, God still keeps his promises. Remember this? Read it again. If we are what? Faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. In the Old Testament, they were pretty poor examples of God's people, but they were still God's people. And he promised that he's going to keep them, and he's kept them around for 4,000 years. And now, for the last 2,000 years, God's people has expanded to include Gentiles as well as Jewish people. And so we are part of God's people. So this is a point I always have to ask, how are you doing as an example to others for Jesus? That becomes the question. Are you a great example, a good example, a neat so example, a not so good example, or a pretty poor example? Well, don't feel bad if you say I'm not so great an example, because God's people in the Old Testament were such great examples. But He will remain faithful to His promises to you. I'm going to drag, Jesus says, I'm going to drag Bob into the pearly gates, no matter how stubborn he is. Huh? This man or this woman wasn't exactly the greatest example, but I promised them that I'm going to bring them into the promised land, so I'm going to bring them into the promised land. Even if they haven't read the Bibles as much as they should, even if they haven't been the best examples. Because I gave them my word, Jesus said, and He's given you all that word, yes? So we should be good examples. Moses' last address, just before he goes up Mount Nebo and dies, makes two good points. Point number one, no one is indispensable. No one is indispensable. And number two, but each person is important and unique. So, point number one, no one is indispensable. Moses, freedom from slavery in Egypt, walked them through the desert for 40 years, took them to the border of the promised land, but he died. Peter, number one apostle of Jesus' 12 apostles. I think if you go back and look when they list apostles, Peter's always named first. He died. Paul, in my opinion, the greatest of all the apostles. The apostle of the Gentiles, he wrote over half the New Testament. Paul, Paul is just one of my heroes. He died. Now, I'm going to bring you down to some people that you know. I want to mention a couple of pastors. First one is a guy named Hal Hartman. Anybody here ever hear of Hal Hartman? Pardon me. In my multiple decades as a Christian, I spent decades meeting other pastors. From every denomination, every major denomination you can mention. I've sat in Nazarene churches, Baptist churches, Assembly of God churches, Catholic churches, Disciple of Christ churches, Lutheran churches, Presbyterian churches, and on and on. I've been in Pentecostal churches, non-Pentecostal churches. I've met, I used to go to, as a pastor, I used to go to pastors' meetings, just meeting with other pastors, and we would pray for one another, we would pray for our congregations, we would pray for each other's ministry, we would pray for each other's congregations. So I have met many pastors in my long life. No one was a shepherd pastor like Hal Hartman. He was the greatest shepherd pastor I personally have ever met. But he wasn't indispensable. The Lord took him, didn't he? How about Mike D? He is the pastor that I mentored down in Fowler for 17 years. I tutored him, I mentored him, I taught him Greek. I tried to teach him Hebrew, but I want to tell you something about Pastor Mike. I've never met another pastor who was such a great evangelist, such a great Christian evangelist as Mike D. Joseph. The man is phenomenal. He has a mind. He is one of the most brilliant, naturally brilliant people I ever met. He can remember things. I don't. It's amazing. Don't you remember the time you said this, Don? And he goes back 12 years to a sermon I gave 12 years ago in the spring. No, I don't remember. Go ahead, remind me. And then when he starts talking, oh yeah, okay. But he remembers these things. He is phenomenal. I watched him, listen to him. He would debate doctors and lawyers. This guy was a cowboy, a literal cowboy. He was a roper, a team roper, and he went around from rodeos to rodeos, team roping. I mean, he's a literal cowboy. He graduated from high school, one of the high schools here in Pueblo, which shall remain nameless, and he was functionally illiterate. And I mean illiterate to the point where he couldn't read, period. He taught himself to read by reading the Bible. And today, like I said, that man can read Greek. I mean, his mind is phenomenal. And he was not afraid to take anybody on to tell them the good news about Jesus. He's brought more people to Christ. I mean, it's just amazing to watch that man work. But you know what? He's not indispensable. He's just not. Martin Lloyd-Jones is the greatest theologian that I personally have read in the last 100 years. One of my heroes. His commentary on the set of Romans alone is 16 books on just the book of Romans. He wrote an 8-volume series of books on just the book of Ephesians. I mean, the man's brilliant. He was a cardiologist. He was a heart doctor. He was on the royal staff, which would have meant if he would have stayed there as a cardiologist, he would have been Queen Elizabeth's personal heart physician. But he left that position as cardiology and part of the royal cardiology department for the king and queen, or the queen and prince and all that of England, to go back to school to become a theologian. But he had the mind of a surgeon. You got to do it this. And so let me show you the scriptures like this, like phenomenal. But he's not indispensable. Martin Luther, probably one of the greatest theologians of the last 1,000 years. Literally. Father of the Protestant Reformation. Stood against the entire church, the Roman Catholic Church, the entire church of Europe at that time. Brilliant, brilliant man. But he's not indispensable. Moses said, Moses said, I'm no longer able to lead you. Yahweh, your God himself, will cross over ahead of you. What is the point Moses is making there? I'm not indispensable. But there's going to be somebody who's always going to be with you. Who's going to always be with you? God. Don't you ever forget that, people. I don't care where you're at, what you're doing, God is always going to be with you. Don't ever forget that. God is always with you. But Joshua also will cross over ahead of you, as Yahweh said. And then the theme of the first chapter of Joshua is what? Be strong and courageous. Over and over and over and over and over again, you will read in the end of Deuteronomy and throughout the book of Joshua, be strong and courageous. That is to Joshua, the leader, and that is to the people, to you and I. In your life today, be strong and courageous, because God's with you. Do not be afraid or be terrified, for Yahweh your God goes with you. He will, what does that say? Be strong and courageous, because God is always with you, and he's never, ever going to leave you or forsake you. It's going to take faith for you and me to, number one, believe that, and number two, to act on it. No matter where I go, no matter what situation I'm in, who's with me? God. And is he ever going to leave me or forsake me?
No.
Nope. And he's never going to leave you or forsake you. So point number one, no one's indispensable. But point number two, but each person is important and unique. So, I want to tell you all about a couple that used to go to this church. If you've not been going here that long, then you probably don't know them. It was a little retired, when I knew them, Alan and Clara Hof were a little retired couple. They loved to do crossword puzzles. Matter of fact, when Jody and I went over to Alan and Clara's house, they had a real nice house, and when you walked in, they had on their walls, they had all these crossword puzzles. You know, they put them in nice frames or whatever, they put them on the walls, because they loved to do crossword puzzles, like 500-piece crossword puzzles and 1,000-piece crossword. My wife would have strangled me if we were doing crossword puzzles together. mustn't go there. Little Alan and Claire used to go to this church and sit quietly. And if you didn't know them, you know what? They'd almost be like invisible. They volunteered to clean the church when nobody else wanted to do it. They were the quietest, sweetest couple, you know, that you could meet. I mean, they were a phenomenal couple. They were very unique, because there is no more Alan and Claire hosts, and they were very important to God's church. Huh. There's a lady in this church named Jeanette Medina. And there's another lady in this church named Patty Turner. And I just started picking out names. If you know Jeanette, she sits back there typically. And she doesn't say a whole lot. And Patty, she sits over here. And Patty doesn't say a whole lot. But you know what? There is no more Jeanette Medinas. There's only one. She's unique. There's only one Patty Turner. She's unique. And each of them is very important to this church. You may not see them. You may not see them up at the front, and they may not be singing up there on the worship team or whatever. But I'm telling you, they're very unique. There's not another one in the entire church. And they're very important to this body. Who's that? Let me tell you about this young lady named Sharon Hartman. When I first met Sharon, she was married to this guy named Hal Hartman. They both came to this church, and Hal was an accountant. He worked for a construction company out north of town. That's all I remember, Hal and Sharon Hartman. And she had 3 kids, 2 of which were really cool. Now the third one's going to be wondering, is it me? They had 3 kids, and they came to church regularly, and Hal the accountant, and Sharon taught, I think it's Central High School.
No,
Where did she teach?
well, when you first met her, she probably was staying at home.
No, but I mean after that.
She taught at Good County and as a substitute, and then she taught at, she went into the homes of kids that couldn't go to school.
Yeah, okay, county, okay. So, she's a teacher and her husband's an accountant. And then Hal became the associate pastor of this church. So suddenly Sharon became the associate pastor's wife. Things changed. And then Hal became the pastor. And so she became pastor's wife. There's only one Sharon. There's only one. She's unique. And she's very important to this church. Now, when I say Sharon Hartman, I include now, because she's the matriarch of the family, all of those that are associated with her. That means the Naglers and the Snows. And who's that guy back there? Oh yeah, the Hartmans. Yeah. Okay. Each and every one of them is very unique. There's not another one like them. And they're very important to this church. And I threw out a couple other names. Chris Pittman. You might know Chris because he sits over here usually at the worship service. And he says, I got just a few things to tell you before the church service. He's also been back to the soundboard, and he's the one who sets up the camera on Sundays so people can watch online. There is no other buddy but Chris Hartman here. Okay? I'm sorry, Chris Pittman. Thank you. He's unique, and he's very important. And Tony Shadwell. Anybody know Tony Shadwell? Huh? I only saw one person raise their hand. Tony! Stand up. Is Tony Shadwell here? The reason Tony, go ahead, stand up. I need Tony to stand up. Everybody turn around and look at this guy. Oh yeah, I remember him. Okay, sit down. See? That's Tony. There is only one Tony Shadbolt. And he is unique and very important to this church. And the point I'm making is this. Every single one of us, every single person in this church is important and unique. I'm speaking of you, and 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 you. Are you getting my point?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
That was the message Joshua had to learn. No one is indispensable, but every person is unique. There's only one of you, and is important to the body. Because God called on Joshua to lead the people in the promised land, not Moses. You all get that point? Who's important in this church? Who's important?
All of us.
Everybody.
That's right. Can you say me? Who's important?
Me.
Say me, not you. Boy, Doris. This is so much like pulling teeth without anesthetics. Who's important? Those people who have blue trucks. Do you understand? Seriously, do you understand that you are important to God in this church? Do you all understand that? Do you understand that there's no one else like you? There's no one else like you. You are unique. And I have to stress this, and I always stress this over and over again because now I'm going to get really serious here. Because there would be less suicides in the church if people really realize their position in the body. There is only one of you. God only created one of you. He created you unique. You are that special. And you are important to Him in His body. He needs you. We need you. You are important. Do you all get that? Okay. And that's an important lesson Joshua had to learn. So God says in the first chapter of the book of Joshua, God says to Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore do what? What does that mean? God says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise. What is he saying there? Thank you. That's a good way of putting it, Bob. Get up and get going. Right? It's time to cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. Now is the time. Get busy. Is that what he's saying? Then he goes on to say, cross this Jordan. It's time to engage in battle. God has promised to bring us into the Promised Land, people. He's given us His word. Joshua is going to be leading us. You all see that? Parentheses. Joshua, what's in parentheses? What's in parentheses? Jesus. Joshua, or Jesus, will be leading us. We need to do what He commands. Why? Here it is again, because I want you to all learn this. If we are faithless, He remains faithful. Why? He's given His word. He's not going to break His word. Even if we break our words. Okay? Please read Joshua. If you haven't read the first chapter, the second chapter by now, please read at least the first 2 chapters for next week. Okay? Because next week we're going to go over chapter 2. Got it? Are you all reading Joshua? Oh, I better not ask that. Do you know why I better not ask that? Because someone might lie and say they are when they're not, and then they die, and then I'd have to explain, why they died in a church. So I'm not going to ask you if you're reading Joshua. I'm just going to be exhorting you. Please be reading Joshua. Okay? Amen?
Amen.
All right, stand there. We're getting too close to Thanksgiving already, Bob. They're thinking about pumpkin pie and turkey dinner. I don't know. Let's pray. Lord God, we come before your throne, and I want to ask spiritually, Father, to put every person that is in this sanctuary before you, Lord, in faith, one by one, individual by individual, family by family. And Father, I'm going to ask, please bless them. Bless the men, bless the women, bless the children, bless them, Father, for they are yours. Watch over them, Father. You've given your word that you're never going to leave or forsake them. So, Father, I thank you for that. Please, Lord, through your Holy Spirit, encourage us to read your word and help us to remember what we read and help us to be shining lights set on the hill for the world to see. And all of God's people said,
Amen.
Amen.